everybody, it is Dean Z speaking to you from room 250 again. We actually have a lot of classrooms here at the University of Michigan Law School, but apparently when Dustin and I went to tape, this is the only one that's available. So here we are. A couple of episodes ago, I answered a bunch of short questions, and one of them had to do with JD Next, which is an LSAT alternative test that has recently come on the scene for law school admissions. After that, I got a bunch of follow-up questions, so I thought I'd do a little bit of a deeper dive into what JD Next is. So, spoiler, lots of statistics going to be involved in this episode. If that makes you recoil, then the, what do you kids say, the TLDR version is good marketing, not great data. JD Next has potential, but I don't think its value has yet been thoroughly established. Let's dive in. The American Bar Association, or ABA, is the accrediting body for law schools. As part of their standards for law schools, they say that we have to use a, quote, valid and reliable admissions test as part of the admissions process. Valid and reliable may sound to you like a good test, like just sort of general language, but it's not. Those are terms of art in the world of psychometrics, which is the measuring of your brain. And so valid means that a test is measuring what it purports to measure. If it says it will measure how well you do in first-year law school courses, then it has to do that. Then reliable is that it consistently gets the same measurement. So it's like a scale. If you get on the scale and it says a number that you are unhappy with, and then you step off and you hope really hard and you get back on, the scale should say the same number. If it doesn't, please let me know because I want that scale. But so that's what reliability is. Note that the ABA doesn't say what test you have to use or how you have to use it. It doesn't say it has to be X% of the weight of the decision. It doesn't say you can't admit anyone below a certain score. None of that. It just says you have to use it as part of the process. Until fairly recently, the LSAT has been the only game in town, the only test that has been deemed valid and reliable for these purposes. But then in the relatively recent past, schools started applying for what's called a variance, which basically just means an exception to that rule, and asking to be allowed to use the GRE. If you apply for a variance, the idea is you're supposed to submit some kind of information, some kind of data or evidence that shows that a test is in fact valid and reliable. The GRE met that threshold, and so schools have been allowed to use it. Now, as of this summer, the ABA has started granting variances for JD Next. And as of this taping, 30-some schools have applied for and been given variances. At this point, I feel like I should disclose, while I am, in general, very in favor of thinking broadly about what we do in admissions and experimenting a bit, I have not ever been persuaded that any test other than the LSAT is worth my while. The LSAT is not a perfect test, but it is a very good, it is as good as a standardized test exists out there in the world. So it purports to predict what your first year grades will be, and it does the extent to which it does that varies from school to school, which makes sense because schools are different and students are different. We have loads of data, many years of data at the University of Michigan showing that it does a pretty good job for our students. Now, just to be clear, please hear what I'm saying. I'm not saying that if you get a lower LSAT and you come to Michigan, you are not going to have good grades. No, people outperform the LSAT all the time. People also underperform the LSAT all the time. So it is not perfect, but it is, as among the tools that we have in our toolkit, it is a very good one. And so I've never felt the need to try the GRE, which is purporting to measure the same thing, but doesn't do as good a job at doing it, if that makes sense. So I am by nature skeptical of JD Next. So just, take that for what it's worth. I will say this, JD Next is quite different from either the GRE or the LSAT. It is not just a test, it is a course that lasts, I think, 6 or 7 weeks. And you can't take the test without having taken the course. And the course itself may be of some value to the applicant. And in fact, that is what the JD Next people say. They say that simply by taking the course, in their words, They make the claim that completing the course rather, important that they're saying completing, not taking, causes a substantial improvement in law school grades and also improves students' confidence in the first year of law school. So the course alone may have some value, but I'm not interested in the course. I'm just interested in the test as an admissions officer. So that's all I'm going to be really talking about. So about the test, the JD Next people say, makes this claim. They say it measures, quote, learning potential, not just cognitive assets. I'm honestly not quite sure what that means. It sounds like it's measuring your potential to learn, but of course your potential to learn is in part based on what you already know, your cognitive assets. So I'm not quite sure what they mean when they say that, but let's put that to the side for right now. In any event, there are 3 published peer-reviewed papers about JD Next. I'm not sure that they're peer-reviewed. I assume they're peer-reviewed. I don't really know what that means. We don't do that in the law. Let's just assume they're peer-reviewed. So there are 3 peer-reviewed papers. They're based on 2 separate studies. And on the strength of those papers, the ABA has granted variances to these law schools. So I wanted to dig into those papers and the studies and make some assessments myself. And unfortunately, what I came to conclude is that the evidence supporting JD Next is not great. There's promise there, but let me explain. So first off, there's a big diminution in the study participants between the beginning and the end of the test. So I'm going to look at some data here because I don't want to get this wrong. And that kind of, the people dropping out of a study is the kind of thing that often causes statistics people serious concerns. So there was a 2019 study that was started out with 119 people, but ended with only 62. So basically dropping by half. And then there was a 2020 study that started out with 305 people, but ended with 238 because of incomplete data from the participating law schools. So basically dropping by a third. Statisticians call this dropping off. They call this missingness, which I think is hilarious because I don't believe missingness is a word, and I just think it's funny. Like, I don't know. I feel like I'm going to try and use this in all kinds of inappropriate settings now that I know this term. And I should also say at this point, I do have some background in statistics, but I did not rely on my own brain. I picked the brain of someone who works with me who has a PhD and is really great with statistics. So he's the one who taught me missingness, which I had been missing with my statistics background. In any event, I am told by my statistics friends that statisticians feel that missingness is something that needs to be discussed in great depth if you have it as an issue in your study. And the JD Next people do not discuss the missingness issue. So that's a problem. One thing, and then you want to think about why did people drop out of the study? And one thing you might think is that the people who dropped out were people who were having trouble with the course and weren't succeeding or didn't feel like they were succeeding. That may or may not be true. We don't have any idea. But if it is true, then the next thing you would conclude is that the data that we currently see supporting JD Next is as good as it's going to get, and that as we get more data, the results will look less favorable to JD Next. Now, the biggest claim that, or to me, the one that really strikes me as a big claim about JD Next is that in the wake of the Supreme Court decision in SFFA, it's going to be a great tool because they claim, the proponents of the test claim, that it minimizes the test gaps based on race, which you see with the LSAT. You also see it with the GRE. Many people feel that those test gaps reflect, an unfair bias against the people in the groups that are not doing as well on the test. So women don't do as well as men. African Americans don't do as well as whites, and so on and so forth. There's various breakdowns that way. But specifically with the racial gap in the wake of SFFA, the idea is, well, if you had a test where there wasn't a racial gap, then you'll be better able to enroll a class that is racially diverse. Unfortunately, I don't feel like that claim is borne out. Another statistics term that I'm going to throw at you very briefly is called confidence intervals. Don't worry, we're not going to get into what confidence intervals mean because I only basically understand it and certainly not well enough to comprehensively describe it to someone else. But I will tell you that for the LSAT and JD Next, the confidence intervals overlap on this issue of racial gaps. That means you simply can't say that JD Next is actually better than the LSAT on this front. The JD Next folks sort of acknowledge this, but they make it sound like it's a small technicality. The language they use is, they said that the LSAT disparities for race are significant, and the JD Next disparities are smaller, but then they acknowledge that the two are not statistically distinguishable. So that kind of technicality is the kind of thing that is the whole ballgame in statistics. It's sort of like when people tell you, well, I got convicted in that case on a legal technicality. All law is technicality. That's what lawyers call law, legal technicalities. Same thing with statistics. Technicalities is everything, right? So there is actually not anything reliable. Now I'm using reliable in two senses here, but there is no good data, let's just say that, to make us think that that JD Next does better with racial gaps than the LSAT does. So that's one of their big claims, one of the big reasons people are interested in it, and it doesn't seem to be holding up upon examination. The other big issue from my perspective, and this was a problem also with the GRE, which is one of the reasons we never took the GRE, is that all of this data is on a population of people who had already studied for and taken the LSAT, and their median score is a 157, which is roughly top third in the nation for LSAT scores. That's a problem because we don't have any idea what kind of predictive value JD Next has in a population of people who haven't taken the LSAT. And of course, if you're only using it for people who've already taken the LSAT, then the JD Next exam is not really adding anything. Why would you want to take both? The LSAT, simply taking the LSAT helps you develop certain skills and study habits that may very well be having an effect on how you perform on the JD Next exam. Bottom line, we can't draw a conclusion about the value of JD Next in the absence of the studying and preparation that has already been done for the LSAT. There are other smaller problems with the data too. For example, they use GRE scores that they then convert, in their words, to LSAT scores, which the psychometricians at the Law School Admissions Council say you can't convert. And I think other psychometricians also say that too. You can't take one test and convert it into a score from another test. So that's a problem. I think they should have just separated out the GRE scores from the LSAT scores. Also, and this is something they acknowledged, the JD Next exam is taken in a lower stakes kind of test setting than the LSAT, so that might also have an effect on how people perform. And of course, one of the benefits of the LSAT is it's testing you in an environment, a kind of high stakes environment that is similar to the high stakes environment you will be taking tests in law school itself. I'm not going to get into all the nitpicking of little things that might be able to be done, but I'll tell you, if you can find yourself a statistician, you can show them these papers, and they will probably expound on this for hours, but Dustin tells me I'm not allowed to do that. I will, though, say a couple more problems with the JD Next, that are a little more apparent, a little more straightforward for people who aren't statisticians. From the applicant point of view, you can't take the test without taking the course, and you have to complete the course in order to take the test. So if you have a problem completing the course because something comes up, then you have to wait and take the course again before you can take the test, and they only offer the course 2 times a year. So that's not ideal. Ideally, you'd be able to have more shots at that. That might be something that gets solved over time, to be fair. Also, from the applicant's perspective, although 30-some schools are saying they will accept JD Next, they haven't said how they're going to use it. They might very well not admit anybody with the JD Next, which definitely happened with the GRE, especially at the beginning, that schools accepted it, but then never admitted anybody using just a GRE. And schools might very well say, you can give us the JD Next exam, but we also want the LSAT, so then you have to take 2 different things, and so that's a real downside. And from the school's point of view, I would say I'm hesitant because we have reams and reams of data and instructions about the appropriate use of the LSAT, and we just don't have that for JD Next. And it's not, I know that from an applicant's point of view, they want to get admitted to the law school. But you are also relying on admissions officers to do a good job and to not admit people who aren't going to succeed at a given law school. So you don't want people willy-nilly. You really don't just want to get in. You want someone with some judgment and some experience saying, if I'm admitting you, it's because I feel confident that you're going to succeed here. And I personally feel as an admissions officer, I would have a hard time having that confidence using JD Next. Bottom line, what I'd say is there's some really optimistic claims here that I don't think are borne out at this stage. They might be down the road. Over time, frankly, because the data set is so tiny in terms of number of people, a few hundred people have taken JD Next versus 80 to 100,000 people who take the LSAT in a given year. So the numbers are tiny. It won't take much, though, to dramatically increase the number of people taking it. So maybe in a fairly short amount of time, we will have better information about how this test is actually going to perform. So bottom line, I'd say it's a start, but we have a ways to go before we see what it's actually going to reveal. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening and letting me wade through all this nerdery. And thank you to Dustin, as always, for coming out on a day when his cat was sick. I really appreciate it. And wherever you go, go blue.